Okay, so now what we're going to do is drill in a little deeper into the automation. So the automation has been greatly enhanced over the last couple versions, and so we're going to talk about kind of an overview of automation and using labels and baselines and what happens with the impact analysis and the build and deploy in general. And then we'll drill specifically, talk about the pipeline builder, which is new, the deployment manager, which you already have, but kind of compare between the pipeline builder and the deployment manager, and then how you can use the automation commands through the command line, and then how you would use them in Jenkins. So that way you have a full understanding of how the automation works. So the main part of the automation is there's kind of two steps to make sure to get the changes moved. So one step is getting the change script. So you can run the build command from DBmaestro, and you have different options to run builds, or you can actually create your own script and then we can execute that script. So but building your own script, that means manual work, so that's not really automating. But if you have scripts that the developers like to write, or maybe you get a script from a third party, you can still execute that script and get it audited and recorded in the change control, even though DBmaestro didn't build the script for you. So there's two steps. The first is building the script, and then the second one is actually deploying or executing those changes. So for teamwork, what it does is it builds the script by comparing your source database with your target database, the objects, and comparing them to the baseline to make sure that it's safe to deploy those changes. So typically you have a lot of changes in the source, and usually you don't have changes in the target. The target usually matches the baseline, so typically it builds the changes and puts them in the script, and then you can deploy them. So we can build the script for you by doing this compare and using the impact analysis, or you can actually make your own scripts, and then teamwork can actually execute those scripts for you, so you at least get it recorded and added to source control and the other things that you get when you run a teamwork generated script. Now, one of the things that we use is labels. And labels work very similar to what you do in source control for your application. So we allow you to add labels, kind of tagging the schema as you make changes. And so when you add a label, what it does is whatever the object revision is at that point in time, so some tables may be on the 4th revision, some may be the first, whatever revision level those objects are at the time you create the label, those revisions get tagged to that label. So it's kind of like a snapshot. So that way, if you ever want to deploy those specific changes, you have that label to represent that specific revision of those objects. So usually what you would do is you would add a label that indicates the version of the changes. So if you're tagging your application code by sprint or by version, you can tag the database changes the same way. So you can add a label after you complete a sprint. Maybe you add a label when you get to a specific milestone in a release, and then you can use those labels for deployment. But it's always, the label always is whatever is in that schema. So whatever objects are in source control for that schema get tagged to that label. And so, if they're not in the source control, they don't get tied to the label. But if they're under source control, they'll get tied to the label so that you can use those labels for part of your deployment. So this kind of shows you there's a view labels command. There's one in SQL Developer and one in the Teamwork client that shows you what the labels are. And you create a label, you give it some kind of name, and then it says which user added the label and when it was added. And then up at the top down here you can say show the objects, and it'll show you the objects that are associated with that label. So the label is really good to keep track of those different changes. So what we do is we recommend that you kind of label like you do on your application side. So if you're really trying to keep the database changes associated with the corresponding application change, use the same kind of labeling method. And then that way you can tie the two together when you want to actually do the deployments. Okay, and then you can always see what labels are there. You can go back and rename them if you need to. You can delete a label if you did one by mistake. You know, so you have some options with the labels, but it's a very good practice to use these labels so that you know what these object changes are related to. And then baselines, we use those so that when we're doing the comparison, we have something to take the source and target objects and have something to compare them to, and that's the baseline. And the baseline is just a label. So if you label by your releases or by your sprints, and then you use those labels when you deploy, you'll know exactly what revision the objects are in your different databases. So like if you label by release, like in my example I had 2.1, excuse me, if 2.1 is in production, then as I move those items through dev, test, QA, staging, whatever, that label stayed with those objects and I reuse that label. So now I've got 2.1 in production. I probably still have 2.1 in the staging or the pre-production, and then in development maybe I'm working on 2.2. But when I go from development to test, my baseline in test is 2.1 because I want to see if there's any changes since the last deployment. And so the baseline becomes my previous version. And so the baseline allows us to see if there's changes already applied to the target, maybe from another branch or another team, and compare those changes to the new changes that are coming in from the development process. So the baselines are very important to make sure that you're doing the proper deployment and you're checking the objects against the right version for the previous version of that object. So the baseline is just a label. So when we set up the automation, we create these labels. You assign one of the labels to be your baseline, and then that's used in that baseline analysis to make sure that it's safe to deploy those changes. And then the automation is set up so that once you deploy labels through the system, it advances the baseline for you. So each time you do a deployment, the baseline gets moved up to the next deployment. So you don't have to keep going in and setting the baseline. Typically you set it once, and then as you do deployments, it increases the baseline to that next version. So this is a key part of the automation to prevent overrides and making sure that your deployments are going to be safe. So if you guys need more information about baseline, I think I have a small white paper on that. But the baselines are very key for the deployment. So what you do is you need to set a baseline inside the source control, and when you bring up the set a baseline, hit the menu option, it brings up this little dialog box. And what it does is it shows your different schemas that are set up in your environment. Now, this is just my demo environment, so it's not very complicated. But typically what you do is you set the baseline to the latest version in the next schema. So if I was going to deploy my collector or my infra, both of these get merged into integration. So when I'm setting the baseline for collector, I'm actually making the baseline on the integration database because I want it to compare what I'm deploying to what's already in integration. So we picked the target. The baseline is in the target schema, but we're setting the baseline on the source schema. So I'm actually setting it on my development schema, but I'm saying I want you to compare the objects that are on the target with its previous version to see if there's been any changes introduced, that might conflict with the new changes I'm trying to introduce. So this is where you set the baseline inside of Teamwork for the first time, and then after that, the automation will advance the baseline for you. Now, if you use Deployment Manager, you can keep the default baseline or you can change it. So if you want to see what happens with a different baseline, you can try that in the Deployment Manager. But the automation is designed to typically use the default baseline that you set, so you don't have to go in and keep making changes. You can just build and deploy and automate those changes and not have to go back and make changes to it, because you want it to be automated as possible. So then the impact analysis runs. So this is what's executed before the script is built. So if you're going to run your own scripts, this impact analysis doesn't run for the build, but you can run something similar that we call a validate that runs parts of this impact analysis to make sure that your script is okay. But in this case, DBmaestro uses the impact analysis to make sure that it's safe to deploy the changes before it creates the script. So it'll use the baseline, the source, and the target objects to do that three-way comparison to make sure that it's okay to deploy those changes. And if it can't safely create the script, it doesn't create the script, it stops. So here with the baseline, what it does is it compares the source to the baseline, the target object to the baseline, and it looks at the source versus the target. So that's the three ways that it looks. And so when it does the look at the objects, if the source and the baseline are the same and the target and the baseline are the same, there's no changes. All three match. So there's no changes to deploy. Now when it finds the differences between the source and the baseline, that's your development changes that you're trying to promote. Now in most cases there's not going to be any difference between the target and the baseline. The target's still going to match the previous version, so we know it's safe to deploy those changes because the target doesn't have any other changes that would conflict. Now in the case where you're doing a hot fix on production, or maybe you've already deployed some changes from another team or another branch, it might find some changes between the target and the baseline. But if there's no corresponding change from the source, in other words, the hot fix has been applied and there's no other changes to that object, that's okay. It's just going to ignore the changes from the source and keep the ones it already has. So basically the target has a more recent version of the object. So it's going to keep that object. Now other tools, when you run this kind of comparison, it would drop the object because it would see it as a difference. But Teamwork, because it knows it's still new, because it happened since the baseline, but it doesn't have any change coming in from the source, from the development process, so it says this is a new change, I'm going to keep it. And then the last case is when you've deployed changes, maybe from a branch or from another team, and so you have the target objects are already changed since the baseline. Now you're trying to introduce a second branch or another team's changes, and they've modified the same object, maybe a long stored procedure, and one team edited a section at the top and another team edited a section at the bottom. Well, there's differences, so you need to merge those changes so you don't lose anything. So that's when the automation will stop, because you need to fix this conflict and merge them. So this is what the impact analysis looks at when it's looking at your changes to make sure that it's safe to deploy those changes. The first three cases, it will go ahead and generate the build script so that you can automatically deploy those changes. The fourth case, if you by default it stops. So the default action is to abort on conflict. It will stop, and you need to merge those objects in order to continue the deployment.
Indeed.
Yes.
People here is amazed about how this analysis works. They think it's great. I think it's very important for them to to take this into account because this is the basis for all what DBmaestro does. One question. What recommendations would you give us to set correctly the baseline? And as you said, it's very important to deal correctly with the baseline. What do we have to take into account to the best practice? What is the best practice to set the baseline?
Okay, so why don't I cover that when I bring up the product and show you how to set the baseline and where you see what the labels are and how to pick the right baseline. Let me show you that in the live product because I don't really have that in the slides. And so I think it'll be easier to explain when I can show you, here's my labels and this is what I picked from my baseline. Okay?
Okay.
But I agree, it's very important to understand how the baselines work because otherwise you won't get the results you want in the script that's generated. So this is, it's a very key feature for teamwork to make sure it's building you the correct script with the right changes. So it is very important to understand how this works. Okay, so we'll cover a little bit more detail about how you pick the baseline when I get to the live portion of it.
Okay, thank you, Lucy.
Okay, so when you run the impact analysis, you have some options. Now these options are in the deployment manager and they're also in the pipeline builder. So you can go in and you check these options as to whether you want to ignore white space, ignore case, double quotes, things like that. So you can toggle these on or off. So it's part of the configuration of the analysis. Now when you run it in deployment manager, you can do it for each job you're running. You can go in and pick different options and try different things, and then if you don't like the results, you can go back, change a few options and run it again. The automation, though, you usually set them in the pipeline builder and it runs. So it's not designed to be interactive, it's designed to be more automated, but the same options are still there. So if you find out you have a lot of white space and you didn't select the ignore option, you can go back and change that option. So these options are there for part of when the impact analysis runs, what kinds of things you want it to look at when it's doing that comparison. So these are the different options you have. And then it runs a build. So when you use labels or I think you guys have Jira, right? If you use things like Jira and Jenkins, you can kind of decide how you want the build to be done. So we can run the build from different kinds of tools. So if you have like Jenkins or you have a full release automation tool like CA or IBM or Urban Code, any of those kinds of tools, we can kick off the build. We can use our deployment manager to do the build, and then you can run our API, the command line, to tell it to go run a build. It's just a Java file. You can go run the Java command and tell it to run a build. And then the types of builds that you can do is you can say just go get the latest revision. So go check the latest revision of all the objects, and if it finds any differences, put those in the build. You can do it by tasks. So if you want to tie your database changes to like a Jira ID, you can build by those task IDs, and then you can use the labels. So if you're adding labels to your database changes to match your development code, then you can call the build and build by that label name to determine which changes you want to deploy. So if you're doing Agile and you're doing sprints, if you want to do a build at the end of each sprint, you can add a label that says this is release 1.5 sprint 1, and that's what you deploy. So you have these different options to generate the script kind of based on what kind of objects you want to deploy. So when you create these deployment scripts, you can, if you do them through Deployment Manager, you just save them into a directory, and then you can execute the scripts by any kind of tool that you want. Or once we set up the pipeline builder, even though you might generate the script through Deployment Manager, you can save it in the directory structure that's defined for the pipeline builder and then the automation command from Pipeline Builder can actually deploy the scripts for you. So that's why we'll set up a working path and everything for the Pipeline Builder and show you how that works. So what we do for Pipeline Builder is we create a specific directory structure that that we know when the scripts are created, we create subdirectories called planned, executed, and custom. And then underneath those main folders, we create a folder for the environment name. So development, test, QA, prod, whatever those environments are. And then as the scripts are generated, we put them in that corresponding folder. So if you create a script for dev, it's in plan dev. And then once we run the script, once we deploy it, it gets moved to an executed dev. So we always keep the scripts. You can create these folders and add them to your source control. So you could add them to like Git or Subversion so that the scripts actually get stored in a version control repository. But this is the directory structure that the Pipeline Builder creates to keep track of the different scripts for the different environments. So when you use Deployment Manager, you can save the scripts in these same directories, and then your automation jobs can execute the scripts for you. So we'll show you this working path and how these all work when we dig deeper a little bit into Pipeline Builder. Now, one of the key things, the tip at the bottom, is you can put the same schema in different pipelines, but make sure that you don't use the same names. Like if you have multiple development environments and schema 1 is a development environment, schema 2 is a development environment, don't call them both dev if they're not the same, if they're different schemas, because then you'll get confused in the directories. So you have to kind of name your environment so you know exactly what those environments are, so that when they get saved in these folders, you know that that's the folder for that particular schema. So most people use some kind of like the schema name on this host, or something, so you know exactly what schema is involved, so that you know that these are in the correct folders. Otherwise, you can risk overwriting the files, because every time you run a build, the plan folder is cleared for that particular environment before it creates the new files. So if you build for one schema, put them in that folder, and then you use the same name for a different schema and you run a build, it's going to delete the build 1 files. So make sure you don't reuse the same name unless it really represents the same environment. So that's the tip at the bottom, and I'll show you that when we go to the tool. Okay, so after the build, the next step is to deploy. So you can take the SQL script that's created and you can run it from pretty much any kind of tool that can run SQL. One of the things that Teamwork has designed is the scripts that Teamwork generates. They're designed to be executed by our deploy command. And so the our deploy command looks for that directory structure that the pipeline creates to find those scripts, and then executes them, and then copies them to the executed folder, and then it has the ability to run custom scripts. So with the planned folder, we create a custom folder. So if you have a script where you want to run a backup before you deploy the changes, you could put that script in the custom folder that says, run a backup of this schema before or export some tables, before I drop a table or something. You can put those in the custom folder and it'll run alongside the regular scripts. So the deploy command, will look in this certain directory for those scripts. And then you can run the deploy command from the same kind of tools. All the DevOps release automation tools from Jenkins. You can, run it from a batch scheduler, or you can run, the API commands, manually if you want to deploy. So there's lots of options of how you actually execute the deploy. So there's 2 steps, the build and the deploy. And so we have different ways to run these commands based on the client tools that you want to run and how automated you want the process to be. So what we did with our 5.0 release is we created this new product that we call the Pipeline Builder. And it's just a client tool where you build your pipeline for your database changes so that you can, run the build step to package up the changes, run the verify, which is the impact analysis, and then deploy those changes to the next environment. So it's very similar to the pipelines that they do like in Jenkins or CA Release Manager. You just, you kind of design how you want the changes to move from schema to schema, and you create that in a pipeline. And it's visual so that you can see how your changes are going to move from schema to schema. So you create this pipeline, you add the different information about your environments, it stores the connection information, it encrypts the credentials, and so you can automate this process much easier and not have to repeat and re-enter the same information over and over. So we store the basic information inside the pipeline so that way when you go to automate it's much easier. So this was one of our new changes that came out. So what we have to do is we have to configure the pipelines. So you have to connect. The pipeline builder is part of your client install. So when you run the client install, you have the choice of the Teamwork client, the sidebar, the pipeline builder, and then the Visual Studio. If you have Visual Studio, you can install the extension for that. But you install the pipeline builder. So you probably need to decide who you want to have access to the pipeline builder. But you connect to the pipeline builder, and you connect to our repository where the Teamwork server is running, and it checks to see if you have permission. So there's two new security options. One as to whether you can read pipelines, look at them, reviewer, or whether you're an editor where you can actually create and edit pipelines. So you can control only certain people can create pipelines and everybody else can just look at them, but they can't make any changes. So you have those new permissions. So first thing you have to do is you have to connect to the Teamwork server so it can get the information from the repository. And then once you connect, you have some menus so that you can create pipelines. You can switch between pipelines. Use messages. It kind of helps walk you through setting up a pipeline. But you have the blue menu bar is your pipeline builder menus. It's its own little sidebar that gives you the options to create a new pipeline. And this is just a couple examples of some pipelines. And so you can see in the first one there's 4 different development environments and they all merge into an integration, and then they go to a QA, and then they go to a prod. Now you control which of these are under source control. So some clients put everything under source control, some will leave the development environments out and put integration under source control. So you can set this up depending on where you want that source control to be and how much control you want on all these different environments. In this example, there's 4 development environments, but each development environment has its own QA environment, and then they get merged into an integration environment and then a UAT and a production. So we design the pipeline based on your environments and how you move changes from schema to schema. And you may have multiple pipelines because you have them for different applications. So you might have this set of schema belongs to this application, and other schemas belong to a different application. So you create different pipelines. So this is what the pipelines look like once we get them created. Okay. So then what we have to do is we have to actually create the pipelines. And this is just some steps. You'll have it in the report or the recording. I can send you the slides. There's a pipeline user guide. But we have to create the pipeline and give it a name, and then we have to set up the configuration. So when I was showing you the options for the analysis, here's those same options. Ignore white space, case insensitive, ignore comments, ignore double quotes. So you can choose these settings inside the pipeline. Now these default to all schemas inside that pipeline. So it's at the pipeline level for this configuration. And then one of the things that you have to enter is the pipeline work path, and that's further down on the screen. And I have some more information on the pipeline work path. So this is that directory structure that the pipeline is going to use to store the script files. So you give us the high-level folder name, and then underneath that we create the plan, the dev, or the plan, the executed, the validated folders underneath that, and then we create the subfolders as you create the different schemas inside your pipeline. So we have to have this directory name. You have to, if you don't fill it out, you can't save the pipeline. But this is where those scripts are going to be stored on your file system. So this kind of depends on where, if you're going to run Jenkins. If you're going to run Jenkins locally, like have a Jenkins agent or a local installation of Jenkins on the Teamwork server, then that directory is set up on the Teamwork server. If you're going to execute the Jenkins from another machine, then the directory structure has to be accessible by the machine that Jenkins is running on. So it could be a network share, it could be a network drive or a local drive, but the working directory has to be accessible by whoever is going to execute the build and deploy commands. So if you're going to do that from Jenkins or from another scheduler, it has to be able to see that directory structure. So that's a key part of the automation. And then this directory structure can be stored in your version control. So if you want to store these scripts in Git, Subversion, and execute them from, retrieving them from Git, you can do that. But the key is having this pipeline working path so we know where the scripts are going to be. So what we do is we create a subdirectory for each environment. So in this case, I have a directory environment called dev. So it creates a plan dev, and then when I execute the scripts, it moves them to executed dev. And then if I run any validation reports, they get put into validated dev so that you can see the scripts and stuff that are created. And then under the plan folder, we create a folder called custom, and this is where you can put your own scripts. And what it does is it looks at whatever's in the planned, like if I'm doing plan dev, it looks in plan dev and plan custom. And then it looks at the file names and sorts them in alphabetical order. So the teamwork script is always called like teamwork _ deploy _ 0. And so if you want something to run before the teamwork script, you would name it with numbers or letters before teamwork. If you want it to run afterwards, like maybe you want to run another backup after you're done with the deployment, you would have to name it after teamwork. And it goes numbers, uppercase letters, lowercase letters. So teamwork is a capital T-E-A-M, so you would have to make it before capital T or after the capital T to determine whether it runs before or after the teamwork script. So that gives you some options to run some additional scripts. Instead of editing the script that teamwork creates, you can add some scripts to the custom folder that'll get executed when you run the deploy. It'll get executed along with your other script. Okay, so then once you have the pipeline created, then you have to add the environment. So these are your schemas. Now you create an environment, you click this box with the plus sign is to create a pipeline. You have to give it a unique name within that pipeline. So that's why I'm saying if you want to reuse the names, make sure that if you reuse the names, it's for the same schema. So this needs to be descriptive enough that you know what schema that this particular environment represents so that you don't get confused and run the wrong environment when you're trying to automate. And then you can add a description, and then you have to edit the configuration for that particular environment. Now what this does is it tells you how you want to run the comparison. Do you want to use the latest label, the latest check-in, the live version, different options of how you want to determine the objects that are included in that build. And then you have to give us the information of where the schema resides. So you give us the host name, and the port and the SID or service name, and then you have to give us a username to run the deployment. Now this has to be, this user needs enough privileges to perform the commands that are going to be in the script. So if you're going to drop a table, alter table, create new tables, recreate stored procedures, this user has to be able to do those commands. Otherwise, the Oracle commands are going to fail because it won't have the right privileges to execute the commands. So if you have like a privileged DBA account that you use for these kinds of things, you can submit that there. Now, another thing to remember is you can have more than one schema in an environment. So this user ID has to be able to work on any schema that might be in this environment. Okay, so if you have an application that uses 3 schemas, you can put all 3 schemas in this environment, so this username has to be able to perform the actions on all 3 schemas. So that's just something to remember. And then once we've filled this out, we hit the create button and we get the new environment. Okay, so once we create it, we get the box. So based on what name we gave it, we get a box created for that environment. And then when you hover, you'll get a little wrench and a trash can. So the trash can will delete it. The wrench allows you to edit the configuration. So you click on the wrench and it brings back up the configuration for that particular pipeline. Now we've already filled in the properties and the configuration when we created it. So now we have to go to the DB credentials and assign the credentials. So when you add these schemas to source control in Teamwork, you save an ID in there and it gets stored in the repository encrypted. So now what you can do is you can take those IDs that Teamwork already knows about and you can assign it to that particular environment. So it lets you know, these are the ones you're connecting to. So if you have multiple schemas that are involved in this application, maybe you have 3 dev versions of the schema, you click the 3 credentials that belong to those 3 schemas, and then you hit the little arrow and move them to this side. And then Teamwork knows how to connect to those schemas to run the impact analysis and get the list of objects and the things that it does as part of the build process. So you just click them off a list because we already have them saved in the repository, and then everything's encrypted. And then when you're done, you click the close button. And then once you have multiple environments, now we have to connect them. So we have to tell them which schema is the source and which is the target. So you have to build the flow between the different schemas. And so we call that a connection. And so once you've saved the credentials, you go through and there's a little out, like a half circle that sticks out that says out. So you hold your mouse button, the left mouse button, and then you drag it to the end of the next environment and let go, and it creates this little arrow. So it creates the connection between the 2 schemas. So in this case, I'm going from dev to HR. And then you hover over the red line and you get a wrench and a trash can. So you click on the wrench and it brings up the connection. So in this case, I have 2 schemas that make up these environments. So what I have to do is I have to connect them. So here they're called HR Dev 1 and HR Dev 4. And here looks like 3 and 2. So what I have to do is I have to tell it how these are aligned. So most likely HR Dev 1 goes to this one, to 3. So I do the same thing. I click my left mouse button on the little out and I drag it to the right in and I let go, and it creates an arrow to tell me how the schemas are linked. So if I have multiple schemas, I need to make sure that they're linked between the dev and the test. I have to make sure that the schemas are aligned correctly. And then that all becomes part of the pipeline, and then we can save it. And then you just repeat it for the different environments that you have in your pipeline. Go back to the slides here. Okay, so there's different types for the pipeline itself. So once we drag the arrow from like dev to HR in that example, that shows that by default the forward action is dev to HR. And so the action types kind of tell you which direction you're going. And so based on which one you pick as the source and the target and the action type, it tells it which folder to go look at for the script or where to place the script. And so in this example, I have dev to HR. So one action is called forward, which means I go from dev to HR. I'm going forward by the direction of the arrow. We also have a refresh action. So in this case, it would go from HR to dev. So it kind of goes backwards from the arrow. So this allows you to make a refresh. You know, maybe you have changes coming in from multiple teams into one environment and you merge the changes. Well, now you can take the merged changes and refresh them back to the original copies. So that's what the refresh action does. And then the self, actually in this case, if I choose dev and I say I want to do a self action, it actually performs it on dev. So if you want to process a script that comes from someone else, someone already wrote a script, you can actually process it in dev, and the automation will process the script and check out the objects and check them in so that you have all that recorded in your environment. So these are the three actions that you can do with the pipeline depending on the direction that you want the changes to go. Okay, so it's important to understand. Okay, so we have the pipeline builder, which is all new and to help you automate. Now we still have the deployment manager, and I'm guessing that many of you have used the deployment manager, but this is more of an interactive client for you to build the scripts. And it's also where we resolve conflicts. So if the baseline analysis finds conflicts, unless you just want to overwrite the changes or fix them manually, you can use the deployment manager to merge the conflicts. So using the deployment manager is helpful if you want to see how the impact analysis kind of works. So you can you choose the source and the target. You can choose to do without a baseline just to see what the differences are, or you can try different baselines to see what kind of results you get. You can also pick like individual objects. So if you need to just move one table change, you can come into Deployment Manager, pick the one table, build the script, and then deploy it, instead of trying to go through and create an automation job just for that one object. So it gives you a lot of options and a lot of control to see exactly what's going to be created in the script, as you're learning how it works before you put it through the automation. And it is the main area to resolve conflicts. So we've kind of designed the automation with the impact analysis so that as long as everything is okay, you can run the automation, it'll build the changes, execute the changes, build the changes, execute the changes, unless it finds a problem. So if it finds a problem where the impact analysis comes back and says you have a conflict, you've made different changes to the same object, and now you're trying to merge them, it'll stop the automation, and then you can see that the job fails, and now you can run the deployment manager to fix the conflicts. So by default, the script generation will stop if it finds a conflict. Now you can override that. You can say ignore the source and keep the target, or override the source and lose the changes that could be on the target. So you can set that in the automation or in the deployment manager depending on how you want your changes to be processed. But the default is to stop if it finds conflict, so you can take a look, merge the changes, and continue. So deployment manager is where we do that. So if you need to resolve conflicts, you bring up the deployment manager, and what you need to do is select the same options that you had when the conflict was executed. So if you're running a Jenkins job to run your build and it fails, well, you come into Deployment Manager and you want to choose the same options. So you want to choose the same source schema, the same target schema, and the same baseline, so that you can run the same analysis and get the same objects that found a conflict. So you pick all the different options and then you click the Analyze button. And then it'll display the results of what it finds, just like the job, so it should show you the same objects that failed in the Jenkins automated build, and show you that the same objects failed in this in the deployment manager. And then you can go through deployment manager and choose, here's the conflicts with the yellow. You would choose merge conflicts, bring up the conflict resolver, which is the little 3 buttons down here on the end, so that you can see, just like I showed that merge slide, I'm going to show it to you again, so you can bring up the 3 versions that was looked in the impact analysis so you can resolve it. So this is what the conflict resolver displays. And so at the top you can see the history of the source and the target object to see when they were changed and which user changed them. Maybe you need to go talk to one of those users to see what's going on. But then we show you the source, the baseline, and the target versions of the objects. And so this is where you can merge those changes and fix the conflict issue, and then save the new version of the object, so then you can deploy that new version. So you resolve the conflict and save it, and then after you complete the merge, you tell it to generate the new script. And so it'll create the script based on what you've corrected in those conflicts, and then you can save the script, and then we can save it in the directory structure that you've set up for the pipeline builder. You can save it in that script. You can go back to Jenkins, run a deploy command. It'll execute the script for you. Now that the script has been fixed, then you can execute it from the same place, from the same automation place where you were trying to build it. So that way you can go ahead, save the new script, and then continue your deployment. So what we have behind the scenes is the commands. So the Jenkins plugin uses these commands. You can go to a command prompt. You can run these commands. You can put them in a batch script. So if you're trying to to kind of experiment, you can try the commands in the command line. If you want to run them in a regular scheduler and not run them in Jenkins, you can run these in a batch file or any kind of a scheduler, or you can just play with them in a command prompt so you understand what they're doing. But all it is it's a jar file with Java commands built inside to do the different types of commands. And so you can always, this is the Java command to get the help, and this is the help that shows you what the different commands are and what you have to pass to those commands. What we call the simple commands are the main commands most likely that you'll be using, and that's the builds. So you can build by latest revision. You can build to a specific label. So if you're using labels in your application code, you can build your application based on that label. Now you can build your database based on the corresponding label and create your build script that way. You can build between labels. So if you want to get the revisions between sprint 2 and 3 and you already have 4 in the system, you can also do that. You can build between specific labels. Or you can build by tasks. So if you check in and assign a task to the database change, you can build by those task numbers to generate just the changes associated with those specific tasks. And then you can run the deploy and you can run the validate. And some of these steps, like build, behind the scenes, it's doing other steps for you. So like if you build latest revision, it's going to add a label for you to the source database to show that you made a build. And then it's going to run the impact analysis and create the script. The deploy step does multiple steps for you, like adding labels, doing the checkout and the check-in, and things like that, so that deploy does the complete process for you. So that's why we call these are just the simple commands that perform many actions. Then if you need to do something special with, maybe you have your own script you want to process, or you have to do something kind of advanced, you can run the individual commands. So If you need to apply a label or set a baseline for new objects, maybe you create a new schema, maybe you need to just generate the script for something special, check in objects, check out objects, enter and exit integration mode. So these are individual commands that many of these are executed by the build or deploy commands, but these are for more advanced users if you're trying to do something very specific where you just can't run the build and deploy, but those are part of the jar file. And then what we do for the Jenkins plugin is we have an HPI file that, yes?
Yeah, I want to ask you a question now that you're going to continue with Jenkins. But before we want to know, we were playing a little with this, testing the automation jar, and it asks for a certify, something to
a certificate. Yes, it needs a certificate, correct?
Yeah, a certificate. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So we need to create that certificate. I can show you how to do that.
Okay. Okay, I understand. So it's something that has to be generated. It's not okay.
Yeah, so what we do is we give you another jar file to generate the certificate, and so you generate it and for your system. So we generate it for your host name, so it's more secure. Before we used to just provide the certificate. Now we let you generate the certificate, and it's based on your host name so that it's more secure in your environment. So I can show you how to do that. I wrote a note. When I get to the my system, I'll show you how to generate the certificate. Because yeah, you definitely need that. Okay. You need that for Jenkins or the command line. Okay. So what we've done for Jenkins is we provide a plugin, and so the plugin is in the download file, and so you get.
Sorry, Zende.
Go ahead.
Somebody. Yeah. Before you continue, somebody wants to do another question.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to translate. I will try. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to try to translate this. He's asking about what's better when you're using the pipeline builder. When you define the environments, it's better the granularity. I mean, is it better to have many steps or many environments and link all together, or it's better to have a few environments, a few items inside the pipeline builder, and use after that Jenkins to link all of them? I don't know if you get it.
I think so. It's probably best to, based on how you move the changes from schema to schema, is kind of match that inside the pipeline. And so, you know, if you have a development environment, if it's one schema, then you create that environment. And then if you move it to one schema, you know, so you design the pipeline to go from dev, test, prod, if it's simple. If you got more schemas that make up an app, then you create whatever the schemas are for the development environment added in one pipeline. You know, it's probably the fewest steps needed, but if you have a lot of steps, then you just need to create each step. And then I'll show you how we link that to the Jenkins. So creating the pipeline is the first step. So how you want them to go from schema to schema, which you should know how you're doing that today, how you move them from one schema to another schema. We'll just kind of mimic that, replicate that, and then Jenkins just allows you to call the commands to generate the build and the deploy. And so I'll link them all together probably shortly. So.
Okay. So I think we will understand this better when we go through Jenkins.
Yeah. So right now I'm just kind of going through the pieces, and then I'll kind of link it all together we'll after I finish these slides, we'll take a short, like a 5-minute break, and then I'll bring up my system and kind of show you how you do these things and how they tie together to work.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So the Jenkins plugin, it's in the download zip that you guys downloaded before the upgrade, and there's under integrations and then Jenkins, and so you get one of your someone that has permission in Jenkins, they have to load the plugin. So they go to the Manage Jenkins page and they load the plugin and they configure it. And so what they have to do in the configuration is in this screen right here. So we give you the jar file, which by default is in the C DBmaestro Teamwork for Oracle Server Automation folder, and it's called twautomation.jar. So you have to put the full file location here where the jar is. So if you're going to run Jenkins from another machine, the easiest thing is to copy the jar file to the Jenkins and the certificate and stuff to where Jenkins is going to run. Now, if you do slaves, putting a Jenkins slave on the server where Teamwork is installed, you can keep everything local to Teamwork, and that seems to be the easiest configuration to set up. So you have to give us the full path of the jar. You tell us the name of the host where the Teamwork server is installed, and then most likely you'll set the default to Oracle. And then here it says show advanced commands. You want to make sure you check that. Whoops. Sorry, I hit the slide and it moved. So you want to check this box to show advanced commands, and then you save this. So this is part of the plugin configuration. And then once you have it configured, then you can actually go and build new projects or add steps to existing projects. So if you already have a build that builds your application, you can have it call another project that does the database, or you can add a step within that project to run the database build. So you have different options of how you want to set up this configuration. But what you do is when you create a new item, you come down and you say add a build step, and then you pick which kind of build you want to make. Okay, so in this example I said I want to build the latest revision. Now the only information I have to fill in is the name of the pipeline, the name of the environment that I actually want to move the changes from, and I have to give it a label. Because I picked build latest revision, Teamwork's going to add a label for you to the source database. Now this is using some Jenkins parameters for job name and build number to create a unique label. So it's going to take whatever the name, in this case I gave the name collector to integration build. So it would say collector to integration build underscore the number, like 12, 1, 2, 3, whatever the number is. And then I chose the action type, which in this case is forward, because I want to go from my dev to my next environment. So you only have to give us minimal information here because all the credentials and everything is stored in the pipeline. So you don't have to, submit all the usernames and passwords, and because it's all stored in the repository. So you just give us minimal information of what you want to run in that particular step. So there's deploy steps, the different build steps. So based on which step you choose, it may change this just a little bit. So if you say build by label, it's going to ask you for the label name that you want to build from. So you don't give it a new label, you give it an existing label so it knows which label to use for the build. So depending on which step you choose in Jenkins, it'll prompt you for the different information. Now it already knows the command to get to the jar file because that's built into the plugin. So when you run it command line, you have to say java-jar, and you have to pass it the location of the file and where the Teamwork server is and that it's Oracle. All that's already built into the Jenkins plugin. So all you have to do is give us the things that are variables, like the pipeline name, the environment name, and labels and type. So it makes it quicker to automate because you go in and create this job in Jenkins and you can run it. So it's quicker to set up. And then you could add additional build steps. So I could add a deploy. You could add publishing the impact analysis report. So there's lots of things you can do with these different steps. So you can add the step to existing jobs that run with your application. You can create jobs just for teamwork, and you can have the application job call this the teamwork job. So you have a lot of options there in Jenkins. So if someone's familiar with Jenkins, they can do a lot of things here to set up how these jobs will run. So you add the build steps, and then you always have to give it the pipeline and the environment that's in every step, and then the other fields are kind of based on which step you choose. And so when you say add build step, this menu comes up, and you can see all the different steps that you can add for DBmaestro. So then once you set up your job, so like here I have collector integration. Now I split out the build and deploy, and one of the reasons I do that is if I have to fix the build because it has a conflict, what I do is I set it up so if the build is successful, it kicks off the deploy job. If the build fails and I have to go through Deployment Manager and fix the conflicts, I fix the build, I put the script in the directory that this would have put it in if it had been successful, and then I can just run the deploy step to execute the script. So that's why I split them out, but it's kind of, your experience with Jenkins and how you want the process to work, you can set up these different steps. Now, it uses the Jenkins security. So, however you log into Jenkins or whatever user is going to execute the teamwork job, you have to set up that security in Jenkins, and then the user that's running the Jenkins job has to be added to teamwork. If you enable the teamwork security, the user that's going to run the Jenkins job has to have the permissions within teamwork to check out, check in, enter integration mode, run the API access, and things like that. They need certain permissions to execute that job. So you can set it up so only certain Jenkins users can run these jobs. So that way you prevent somebody else from running a build that's not supposed to. So between the Jenkins security and the teamwork security, you can control who can run these particular jobs in Jenkins, and that way, you can make sure someone doesn't run something they're not supposed to. Okay, so you have, different options when using the Jenkins, you have an extra layer of security in Jenkins. And that's the end. Yeah. Question?
We have one question here. It's about the DBmaestro plugin configuration in the section when it says DBmaestro Teamwork Properties. This isn't the job, yes? Yeah. Are we going to see something about that configuration?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, because we want to know what options should we check there and everything, but maybe we're going to see that.
Yes.
After this. Okay.
Yeah. So what I thought we'd do now is take like a 5-minute break. Quick, you can get coffee or run to the restroom, and then I'll come back and I'll bring up my system and I'll kind of walk through these different areas.
Okay.
And show you, this is how you set up Jenkins, this is how you set up the pipelines, and then this is what the Jenkins jobs look like inside, what the actual jobs look like when I run this, and I can run some jobs and, show you where the files go and things like that.
Okay, great. Let's have some coffee.
Yeah. So okay, I have 10:38, so let's make it 10:45. So you get a 7-minute break to get coffee and use the restroom. And I'm just going to mute, and then I'll be back in just a few minutes.
Okay. See you.
I'm back whenever you guys are ready to start up again.
Cindy.
Everybody back?
Give us please 3 minutes.
Okay. Let me know when you're ready.
Okay. Okay, Cindy.
All right, everyone ready? Okay.
Yeah, we're ready whenever you want.
Okay. So what I've done is I've brought up my client and to show you kind of how I have my schemas and stuff laid out. So here I have my HR Dev Collector and my HR Dev Infra. They're all copies of the HR sample database from Oracle. And then what I do is I develop in these two, and then I merge them in migration, and then I move them to test and move them to production. So I've numbered them to keep them in order, because normally it does it alphabetically, but prod would come before test if I didn't put the number. So that's a little trick, is to number them if you want to maintain the order. So this is just for my HR application. So what I did in the pipeline was I duplicated this, trying to move this one. I've kind of duplicated this same kind of layout. So I have collector and infra, and they move to integration, move to test, move to production. So you were asking about the steps. So what you need to do is kind of simulate, how you do your work and how you would normally, script to move the changes from database to database. You kind of, set up the same kind of layout in here. Now, as I created these, here's the little wrench. I just called it collector. And then in my configuration, I said I wanted to do the latest check-in, because I'm not doing a specific label. I'm saying do whatever the latest changes are. That's what I want to move. I've set my baseline as the default source, which means it's what the default baseline I set on the collector schema is what it's going to use. Now I can override the script path that I gave, but most likely you don't need to do that. This is the name of my host, because I have everything on the same machine, my Oracle. Now I'm using system just because for me that's easy. I don't have to worry about anything failing. But this is the user that's going to actually perform the commands. So when we connect to these different schemas, this is the username that's got to be able to execute those kinds of commands. So it needs to have a high enough level, to create objects, alter tables, things like that. So just keep that in mind. If you have like a DBA user that you like to use, then that's a perfect one. Then I came in and I chose the credentials. Now when I first started, once you use it in a environment, you can't reuse it. Okay, now you can use it in another pipeline, but it can only exist once within a single pipeline. So I identified my credential, which is my HR Dev Collector, and I saved it as part of this configuration. Now the automation tab, I really didn't show it in the slides, but this will give you an idea of what the command line would be if you wanted to run it, from a batch script or, from the command prompt. So here I would pick, here I said build latest, and this is the command. So it's telling you what you have to fill in for the pipeline, the environment. Now I would have to replace the label name because that doesn't mean anything, percent label name percent. I'd have to pass it a variable or just modify it right here. And then it says it's going forward. Here's my Teamwork server and my Oracle DB. So this is the main command I would use if I wanted to do it from the command line. So you can always get the basic command by going to this drop-down box. So if I wanted to deploy, this would give me the deploy command. Okay, so usually what I do is I copy this into a notepad or something and edit it, edit the label name, and if I need to run a batch script just to, when I'm trying different things. But that will always give you the basic of the command so you know what you have to pass to it. So I don't need to modify this. And then in my flows, I can also modify those. So when I created them, I only have one schema, so I just had to connect collector to integration. So mine was simple. But if I had multiple schemas, I'd have to line them up. I'd have to say, okay, collector goes to integration, and maybe sales goes to sales collector, goes to sales integration. You'd have to tell us which schemas go together. But in my example, it's very simple, so there's only one schema. To see the pipeline configuration, it's up here. So this is to add a new environment. So if I needed to add another box, I could click here and it would ask me for the name and the configuration. Okay. And then if I want to look at the overall pipeline settings, I go to this little gear, and this will show me the configuration. Now if I wanted to store my scripts in SVN or Git or TFS or Perforce, I could choose one of these, and then I can, like I say, I'm going to run this from Jenkins. And then here it says what I want to do when I find a conflict. Do I want to abort? Do I want to ignore or override? Okay, so you have some choices. We usually keep it abort because you want to know there's a problem so you can fix it. And then here's where you can set some of these options. And then if I scroll down, Here's some of the deploy options. So these are also things that you can see in Deployment Manager. It's all part of that one screen before you click Analyze. It's got the comparison options and the deploy options. So you can, say whether you want the schema name in there. And then this is the important one, this work path. So see, I have C users teamwork automation as my work path. Okay. And then if I have lob and clob data, I have to put directories to save that kind of data. I don't have that kind of data, so I don't have to worry about it. But this one is the key. So if I come out to my directory structure, I scroll up here. So here's my users, my teamwork, here's my automation. So if I click on automation, I have executed and planned. Now I haven't run a validate, or I'd have a validated folder too. If I go into planned, you can see I have collector, infra, and integration. I could also have custom if I had custom scripts to run. Okay, so this is the directory structure that the pipeline builder, when I build scripts, is going to put them in here depending on which environment I built them for. And then when I run deploy, it's going to look in these folders, and if it's successfully deployed, it'll move them to the right folder over here under executed. So that's why you have to give us this some kind of name, directory name, to store these scripts in. Okay, and these scripts have to be wherever the command is going to run from. So right now I have everything running in a VM, so it's all the same machine. If your Jenkins is on another machine, then you have to set up the directory structure where that Jenkins machine can see it. It can be a network drive, but wherever you're running Jenkins, or the command has to be able to see these folders. Okay, so this is where I told it which folders I want, and that's for that pipeline. Now you can share the folders. You can use the same work path in all your pipelines. You just have to be careful with these names, because if you use the name collector in another pipeline, it's going to use the same folder, and if it's for a different schema, you might be overwriting files. So you just have to be sure that when you identify these names that they're you know what they represent, and you can find the corresponding folder if you need to go look at the script. So this is my pipeline. So what I've done is I've made some changes in collector, and I already checked them in. So if I go to Jenkins, I already have these builds set up. So if I come into this build, all I did was, you can override. You don't have to fill this out. It'll pick the default. And then if I want to pull the scripts from source code, I can do that. Here I did the build latest revision. So what we do with the pipeline is we always lowercase and remove spaces. So if you look at my pipeline, it was called HR space application. All the space was removed, and these letters were lowercased. So if I come back here, see, it's just HR application. I want to go from collector. I gave it this label name, and I said I want to go forward. Then I came down here and I said I want to build another project to do my deploy. And I said only run it if the build is stable. So if my build script is executed correctly, it will run the deploy. If I have a conflict, it'll stop. And then down here I use the publish HTML report. This is just a plugin that's free. And I told it I wanted to publish my teamwork analysis report. So this directory is part of my pipeline. So it's the C users teamwork automation. Planned collector is the folder, because I'm building off the collector environment. And then the report's always called teamwork under impact analysis under report.html. And then you can give it whatever title you want. And usually I say allow missing report, and then I can save it. So if I run this job, it's going to do a build from collector to integration, and I checked in a few changes, so we can go ahead and run the build. And then I'll bring up the console. So the first thing it does is it repeats the command, so you can see it's calling the jar file build latest, passing the pipeline and the environment names, and then here's my new label, collector integration build 1, because it got this from the job name, and then the 1 came from the build number, and it's going forward, and it's you know, running my teamwork server. So Jenkins filled in the rest of the command. All I had to do was give it these few choices, and it did the rest. So then what it's going to do is it's going to add a new label. So it's going to add this collector integration build one label to my collector environment. And then this is what we need to build. This is the certificate. So I'll show you how to do that. And then it's running, it's applying the label, and then it's running the impact analysis. And then here it created, it created the folder for custom. I don't have any custom scripts, but, and then here it says it's created the impact analysis report. And it should have the script name. Okay, and then here's the script. See, it says it created this file. So it created this is the script that was generated. It generated the impact analysis report. And then it said there was a downstream job to trigger. So it triggered my deploy. Okay, so if I come back here, the deploy got kicked off and ran. So if we look at deploy, and we'll look at the console output. For the deploy, it did a similar thing. It repeats the command it's running. It checked for the certificate, and then it went to look for the script. So here it says it added a label, a backup label to the target. So now it's deploying, it adds a label on the target that's called, whatever label you give it, it appends _backup, so that we have a rollback label. So if you need to roll back this whole deployment, you have a label to roll back to. And then here it says it's executing this SQL file. So see, it looked in the plan collector teamwork deploy for the script, and then here it's showing. Here I altered the departments table, I added an index, I fixed the secure DML, and I updated some data in the locations table. Then it disconnected from Oracle. Here it's telling me that it updated the report. It says I have no version control selected. So here what it does is it exits, and it entered the integration environment. So here it's going to exit the integration environment, integration mode I mean. So normally when you're using the source control, you have to check out and check in the objects to edit them. Well, for automation, that's not very practical. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the integration mode, using that from the client. But the automation enters the integration mode to allow the script to be executed by that user. So when it's in integration mode, only the user that puts the database in integration mode can make changes. But they don't have to check out the objects. They can just run the script. So it executes the SQL script that was generated, and then when it's done, it exits the integration mode, and that checks out the objects for you. So it sees which objects you've modified, it checks them out, and then it checks them back in. And so what it does is it creates this file here called changed objects list that lets you know which objects it actually modified, and it saves that file for you. And then after it checks them out, it checks them in for you as part of the deploy, and then it gives you a new label. It assigns the label that you gave it. It assigns that label so that you know that the deployment was complete. Okay, so deploy does all those steps for you in order to execute the command. Okay, so the deploy was finished. So if I look in SQL Developer and I open up my integration, I modify the departments table. So if we look at the history, here it's got today's date. It did a check-in of that object. So it checked it out and checked it in for me. The stored procedure, it did the same thing. It did a check-in for me. I don't show this. So see, it did a check-out and a check-in to save the new revision. So it did all that as part of the deploy command. So now I have a history of what the deploy changed for me in that other database. So it used the information from the pipeline. I called it from Jenkins, and it ran the job and deployed it. Okay. So questions about what I did here in Jenkins?
Cindy, one question here.
One, how can I see the change of the data you
How can you see the change of what?
of the data?
The data. Okay. So I did change the data table. So, oops, wrong one. So locations, I changed the locations table. So to know what change was made, the easiest thing is to go to the history and compare between the two revisions. And I can say compare revisions, and it'll tell me what was different. So here before it was 6823 for location ID 1300, and now it's 1111. So this will show you what changed. Did that answer your question?
Another question, Cindy. We were using the automation jar from using as an slave. We told you we were using the slave in the Windows machine.
Okay.
To run the automation jar. When we run it, we get an exception. It's about authentication. I will read you. Let me see. Authentication was successful, but cannot locate the user information for the user who is logged into Jenkins. Is it? Is it? Okay. This error is related to the Active Directory. We would like to know how this deals with the credentials, because we wasn't expecting this error to appear.
Okay. So
only when we use the plugin, yes.
Okay, so when you configure the Jenkins job, you log in as a particular user, or you determine who's going to execute this job, right? So you use the Jenkins credentials to say who's going to run the job, okay? Now I'm running as my teamwork user because I do everything as the same user on this PC, on this VM. So that user that's going to run, so maybe you log in as yourself, domain name Diego, and then that's how you're running the Jenkins job, okay? When you go to teamwork, and I'm not sure, have you guys enabled security? Have you gone here and go to the security tab? Okay, so have you enabled security mode?
Let me see. Let me see. We're checking. No,
It's under Options, Administration Settings.
Yeah, one moment.
Okay.
We're opening.
Okay.
So security configuration.
No, administrative settings. Options, administrative settings. Yeah. To see.
Okay. Let me see here. Options. Options administration. Yeah. We have to run it. Administrator. Yeah.
Pero ahora, ok, bueno, si te pasas por ahí lo es. Options, security configuration. Y murió.
A mí se me quedó ahí, no, me lo abrió.
No, it's in administration settings.
Ah,
Ah, ya, sí, sí. Seguro.
solo como no me sale esa opción.
What happened here?
No en security configuration.
No.
Ah, sí.
Okay.
Ah,
So Cindy, we have this. No, we don't have this option. I don't know what's happening.
Okay, only,
Maybe,
okay.
Let me see. Wait. We just have general.
Okay,
We
so
don't.
only certain
Mode.
people can see the security mode tab. So
Yeah.
you need someone that, like the main user, the admin user, can see the security mode. So if someone with the security mode can see if it's turned on or off, but it sounds like it might be on. So what you have to do is you have to look at your permissions, and so
Yeah.
the user that's coming in from Jenkins has to be added as a user somewhere in one of these roles. So like if I look at administrators, I'm the only administrator. If I go to teamwork users, I don't have a user. If I do security, it's only me. So only the security administrators can see that tab to enable and disable security. So you'll have to find the main admin user to see if that's enabled. And then if it is enabled, you have to create a role that and you may have to add that if is Jenkins running on Linux or Windows?
Yeah, we have to create the role. Maybe we could continue and try to configure. I don't know.
Okay, so the user that's running the Jenkins job has to have certain permissions, and I think I have a list in an email somewhere, but one of them they need is API access.
API access, okay.
And then they have to be able to do like checkout and check-ins, because the deploy command does the checkout and the check-in. They have to be able to do things like trying to see what it's called, the integration mode. They have to be able to enter and exit integration mode. So they need, and then like add labels, they have to be able to add labels. So there's certain permissions that the Jenkins user needs to have because of what those commands are going to do. So most of them, like deploy enters and exits integration mode, applies labels, does check in and check out, and then the build command applies a label, and so it needs to be able to add labels if you're going to run a build. So you have to make sure that those users that are going to run from Jenkins have permissions to run the commands. And then, if you don't want certain users to be able to run from Jenkins, then you don't let them have the API access. And then they can't run the jar file because they don't have the API access. So that's how you can prevent people from running a build if you don't want them to. Okay, if you have security enabled. The second step is the certificate. So if I come to my download folder, let's see, I think I've removed it. Okay, so here I can come here. So here's the 511 zip. So within here you have this integrations folder. Right here it says generate certificate store. What you need to do is copy this file, make a copy of this jar file, go to your DBmaestro. So I leave it on C. So Oracle Server, Automation, and see, I copied it here. And so this is where the other jar file is. Let me make this a little bigger. So here's the regular jar file. This is our automation jar file. So you copy this jar here, and then what we have to do is we have to create the certificate. So let me copy the name. And you come over here, and I'll just exit. I don't need to be in SQL. Okay, so I'm in the wrong folder, so I need to go CD. Okay, CD DBmaestro Teamwork Oracle Server Automation. See if I spelled it. Nope. Teamwork. Yep. Okay. So now if I okay, so here's the jar file. So what I have to do is I have to create the certificate. And what you do is you say java-jar, and then I'm going to paste the name, and you just run it. Okay, so you just enter the name and you run it, and it's going to ask for the host name, and that's where the Teamwork server. So on mine it's teamwork-jar -PC is the name of my server that runs my Teamwork server. Okay, and then it asks for the port number. It's 8012, and it'll generate the certificate. Okay, and then when you're done, you'll have this file, this dbmcacerts.jks. So it'll create that file. See, it's got a new date because I just recreated it. And so that's the certificate you need. So if you need to run Jenkins from another machine or automation from another machine, you have to copy these two files, this jar file, and this lib folder to wherever you're going to run. So if you have a slave agent that runs on the Teamwork server, that's great. You just create it and leave it all here. That's the easiest way. Okay.
Okay, Cindy, perfect.
Okay.
Any other question?
So I just want to go back. Okay, so I had my app, so I set up my pipeline to match my app, and then I created Jenkins jobs to do my different builds. So here's my collector to integration, here's my infra to integration, and then here I can do like a validate. So a validate will verify that the environment hasn't changed. So maybe once I get it to integration and I move it to test, I build a script, maybe for the whole release. Maybe I've been applying sprints here. You know, maybe I do 4 or 5 sprints and then I decide, okay, I want to package up all of those sprints and make one release. So I run the analysis to create the script for all the changes and I move them to test. Okay, I have the script that I ran on tests, so I've already tested that script. I know it works. So instead of building a new script from test to production, I can take the script that I ran on test and I can validate it to make sure production hasn't changed. You know, so maybe make sure someone hasn't applied a hotfix. So I can run a validate command between test and production to make sure it's okay and just rerun the same script. So that's what the validate kind of runs the impact analysis without building a script. So just to check it. So if I go into my validate job, you have different options of what you want to validate. So if I say advanced, you can say I want to, this one I'm checking between integration and test, and I can give it the label, like this is my baseline label, and if I've already generated the script, I can use the change file to verify that that change is still going to run successfully in that environment. So that's what the validate kind of runs the impact analysis, but it doesn't generate a new script. It validates what you already have built or validates that the environments haven't changed. So this would validate that if I wanted to move from integration to test, that test doesn't have any new changes since the baseline to interfere with what I want to deploy. Okay, so you can run the validate anytime to see if that environment's changed, to make sure that, you know, someone hasn't merged another branch or, you know, applied a hotfix or something like that. So you can run the validate. So that's a new step that was added not too long ago. But so I set up my Jenkins jobs. You know, you can create different views and set up the jobs per application. If you want to keep them in a certain order, you can do the numbering trick again, because Jenkins always does them alphabetical. So if you want to make sure that you run them in a certain order, you can put numbers in front of them. But just want to tie everything together. So I have my pipeline builder, and then I have my Jenkins jobs that go along with the pipeline to move the changes. Okay, so that's how they're kind of all linked together. That makes sense? Any questions on that?
Okay, Cindy. I think we got a good basis for this.
Okay.
Now the job is for us to configure this
Okay.
in our own environment. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So just a little bit about baselines. Okay. So if I collect my collector environment, so I have, you know, I don't have very many tables. I just have a few tables, a few procedures, etc. So here I can go in and I can say view labels. Okay. So this was my original label, and this was the one I just added. So when I ran that build job, it created this label called build one, and you can see below I've got .2 of these tables, .5 of this table, .6 of this table, so you can see the revisions that are tied to this particular label. And so if I come back up here, so like jobs is 0.5. If I look at my original jobs, if I can find it, jobs is 0.4. So on this label, it's 0.4. On this label, it's 0.5. So this label has a change in it. Okay, so you can see which version of the objects are tied to that label. Now the build added this label for me because I told it to build latest revision, so it made a tag that said this was the latest revision that I just built, and these are all the objects that are tied to that label. Okay, so that's what the labels are. Now if I want to set a baseline, I can right click and say set baseline. Now I can still see all the labels. Now what this is showing me is my baseline is set in integration because collector goes to integration. So what I'm choosing as my baseline is the previous version of integration to make sure that it sees if there's been any changes to the integration environment before I try to push my changes from collector. Okay? So the recommendation is to choose the baseline for your target schema. Now I'm setting it on the collector, so I'm setting the baseline on my development schema, but I'm pointing the baseline to the next environment. And I originally started on 2.1. If I make this bigger, you can see I ran the deploy, which was the backup. When I deployed those changes, it created the backup label, and then once I was successful, it created the label I gave it, and it made that the new baseline. So my original baseline started here, which was matched. I had 2.1 in all of my schemas. That was my original baseline where everything matched. Okay, so it set my baseline to 2.1 originally, so I could see if there was any changes to integration since version 2.1. Now I didn't have any, so it deployed the changes and advanced the baseline to the now current version, which will be used if I try to push the next level of changes. It'll compare this as the baseline to see if there's been any changes made to integration since I last deployed. Okay, so that's how the baselines work. So when you set these up, you need to look at where these schemas are going to go to, where the changes are going to be promoted to, and then you set the baseline on that schema. Okay, so you're saying the default source baseline is what I'm going to use, but the default source baseline is actually pointing to my target. Okay, so this is where you go in and set the baseline. And then for integration, if I cancel here, if I go down to integration, I got to connect first. If I view the labels on integration, this shows, okay, I have my 2.1 and my integration, the deployment I just did. And if I set the baseline's set to test. Now I haven't deployed anything to test yet, so test is still at the previous version. But if I push from integration to test, it would give me a new label and it would advance the baseline to the next version in test. Okay? Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
Okay. So if you pick the wrong baseline, like if I'm in integration and I pick an integration baseline, it may not see any conflicts the right way. So it's important to pick the next one, so that because you want to see if there's any changes to where you're going to deploy to. Okay, so you can experiment in Deployment Manager and pick different baselines and see what the results are to make sure you really understand and you think you're going to, you know you're going to get the right objects. So in Deployment Manager, you can, pick different baselines and try them. But the recommendation is to, for the source, set the baseline to the test, to the next one, okay? Now when I get to production, or if I get to test, if I say set baseline, it's still set to test. It could be set to production, but in this case I just set it to test because I don't usually I don't, in my little test environment, I don't usually go all the way to production. I just usually stick with these right here. But I really should check it to production. I should set my baseline. So let's do that. So I could go to production. Oh, I don't have any labels in production yet. So that's why it's set here. Okay. All right. So that's how you set the baselines. And then once you set them, when you do the deployments, it will promote it'll move the baseline for you to the most recent deployment. So that way you always have it on the latest version, the latest deployment, and then you shouldn't have to go in and edit it. Okay? All right. So let's see. Covered Jenkins, we covered Pipeline Builder. Are you guys familiar with Deployment Manager?
Not really.
Okay. So I checked in some other changes in my environment. So in my integration environment, I have a couple changes. I made a change to this secure DML, and it's still, the other one I changed it here and I've already promoted it. And so I'm going to have a conflict. So if I come to Jenkins and I run this build, this one's going to fail because I have a conflict. So we'll let this one execute. So it's going through and checking. Okay, so here it says error occurred, build process during generate deploy script.
We're having some trouble with the connection. I don't know if what end would be.
Okay, we'll give it a second.
Let me see, what can we do?
I'm just showing a bunch of text, so you can tell me when you catch up.
But I don't know. Can we just try? I don't know, what can we do?
It's showing you still connected.
I think it's better now.
Okay, so you see, can you see the text with one row highlighted?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I think we understand. Yeah, continue,
okay.
Please.
Okay, so it said it couldn't generate the script, and here it says abort on changes, generation of script was aborted on conflict. Okay, so that means my build failed. So if I come back out here, the build failed. So what I did was, in the impact analysis, I set up this situation. I made a couple changes in collector and I pushed them to integration. Okay, now I've made some changes in infra and I'm trying to push them to integration, but I did the same objects. So when I come into this build, I'm publishing my impact analysis report. And so here you can see on my departments table, it said the source matched the baseline. So basically I had no updates in infra, but I already had updates in integration because I made a change from collector, but that's okay. So we're just going to ignore it. So basically this one's out of date. Employees table, I made a change in infra, but there's no change in integration, so that's okay. We can push this change, it's okay. The jobs table, I added an index, but I didn't add it in infra, but it was already promoted from collector. So again, this one's out of date. We're just going to ignore it. And then here's my store procedure. It says it has a change in the infra that I'm trying to promote, and I'd already promoted a change from collector. So it says I have a conflict. And then I did the same thing with the locations data. So to fix that, what I can do now is I can come to Deployment Manager and I can pick the same options. So I was trying to deploy from infra, so that's my schema. I was trying to do latest revision. I have content. And then I was trying to deploy to integration. So I select that. And then here's my label. This was my original baseline for infra because I haven't promoted any changes from infra yet. So it still sees the original baseline. So then I tell it to analyze. So on collector, I deployed so the collector baseline on integration is more advanced. But on infra, I haven't deployed anything yet, so it still sees the original baseline. So the baseline is going to show that I've moved those changes from collector because those changes were done since that 2.1 baseline. So it's going to see those changes and know that I have a conflict. So here's my conflict. It gives me a yellow circle. It says I have a change between the source and the baseline, which was I changed some data in that stored procedure, and I had already promoted a change from collector. So it says to merge. Now I could come in here and I could say ignore it, ignore the change, go ahead and override the change, I don't care what's already there, or merge. Now that's your decision. I mean, most likely you want to merge. And then to merge, I come up here and I bring up this conflict resolver. And this was what was in my slides. It shows that I made a change today, and I made a change today, and then this is what they look like. So here's my infra environment. Here I changed it to 9 o'clock and added the exclamation points. So the baseline still says 8 o'clock, no exclamation points. Here on the target, I changed it to Saturday, Sunday spelled out instead of abbreviated, but I still have 8 o'clock like the baseline and no exclamation points. So I need this change from here, and I need this change and this change from the source version. So I need to merge it. Let me hide the history. So I need the changes from both environments. So it's got different merge options. The easiest is to do merge in resolve inline, and it's going to look at the changes here and look at the changes here and resolve them. Okay, so here I got the 9 o'clock from the source. I got the exclamation points from the source, but then it saw the change in my target, so it gave me the Saturday, Sunday from my target. Now if this is more complicated, you can resolve each box and step through it and resolve each one. This one's a simple one, so I tell it to kind of automatically merge it for me, and I double check the results. Those are good, so all I have to do is save it. So now I've resolved that conflict. I merged the two changes, so now I don't lose what was already deployed, which would have, if I had overridden it, I would have lost that Saturday, Sunday change I made because it would have got overwritten. For the data, I also changed some location data. And so this was the one that I had changed already. I changed 1300 from 6823 to 1111. Well, there's no reason to run that one again, but I need to run these updates. And these are the ones that came from the infra team. They modified 1600. They just put a 1 on the end. They added a new 5000, and they deleted 3200. So I need to tell it to generate a new script to process these data changes. And then I just save it. Okay, so I've resolved the conflicts. Now what I need to do is I need to tell it to generate a new script for me. So I come over here and I say generate script. And it's going to create the script that the build should have created, but the build couldn't because it had conflicts. So I've corrected the conflicts. I've built a new script. So here we have the script, and then down here there's an index. So here I jumped to creating columns. So I added a column on the employees table called passport. Here's my new stored procedure. It's got my 9 o'clock, my Saturday, Sunday, and my exclamation points. So if I click here, it jumps to the stored procedure. And then at the end, we recompile invalid objects. So I've generated a new script, so now I need to save it. So I'm going to click the Save button. And what I'm going to do is, this is where my pipeline builder is C Users Teamwork Automation. And I want to go to the Plan folder, and this is for the infra environment. So I chose the infra folder. And so I save it, and now it's there. So now if I come over here, and I get out of this one, and come back down here, here's my planned infra folder. Here's my new script. So it says 1133, 1133. So this is the one I just created. Okay. Now this is left over from the previous job. That impact analysis report I looked online is still there, but I've saved the new script. So now I can go back to Jenkins, and now I can just run the deploy. That's why I separate the build and the deploy, because I can't run the build again because it would still have the conflict. So now I can come here and run the deploy, and it's going to run my new script that I just saved and execute those changes. So that's one of the reasons I separate the build and deploy. If the build is successful, it kicks off the deploy. If the build fails, I can fix the script and then just run the deploy job on its own. Now if you have your own scripts, you can do the same thing. I can put them in the folder and run the deploy, and it'll run MySQL scripts through the system. So you have, some options. If you get a script from a vendor that, you want to track it and have all the changes checked in, you can do that. You can add their script to the folder, run deploy, it'll run it for you. Okay? So now if I come back into SQL Developer, here's my integration, here's that stored procedure. So now I got to refresh it. So now it's got 9 o'clock, Saturday, Sunday, exclamation points. And then if I bring up the locations table again, go to data. So here's my new 5,000. Here's my 1,600. Now it's got a 1 on the end, and the 3,200 was deleted. So I was able to merge the changes through Deployment Manager and then save that script back out to where Pipeline Builder is looking for it and run it through Jenkins. Okay? So any questions on the Deployment Manager?
It's all right.
Okay. So here on Deployment Manager, I skipped this step, but here's the options. So these are in Pipeline Builder, or here's the deploy options and the comparison options. So, just like Pipeline Builder, you can set them here. You can say which folder it's going to go in. You can, pick your lob folders and things like that. Okay. So with the new Pipeline Builder, once you set it up, you can, so if I come back to my home screen, it shows me the pipeline name. So if I want to create a new one, I just do it here and I say test, and I set up, if I want a version control tool, Jenkins, do my settings. So here I'll do a new. Okay, and I'll say create. So now I have a new one. Okay, so now if I come out here to C drive, I can get it to, okay, so now I have a new folder. So now I can add my environments. So I'll just kind of repeat the other ones because that's all I have. I could, pick which comparison type. If I wanted to look at the live version, I could do that. Usually I do latest check-in. I have to fill in my host. Now normally these would be on different hosts, but since I only have one machine, they're all the same. And then I say create. Okay, so now I have the box. I can move it. I can come in. Now the configuration I've already entered. So now I got to go to DB credentials. So see now these are all my credentials I've already saved. So this is my collector. I can add it over here. If I want to look at the automation commands, I can. Whichever, and then I just say update and I save it. Now I actually create my next one. I'm just going to go ahead and do integration and repeat the host. And say create. Okay, so now I have the two environments. So I have to come in here, save the credentials. This one's integration. Okay, so anytime it says unsaved, every once in a while I save it. Okay, so now I need to connect these. So here's the out. So I want collector to go to integration. So I hold down my mouse and I drag the arrow and I wait for it to catch up. And when it has a green thumb, you let it go and it creates the connection. And then I go in here and I have to kind of repeat the process because this could have multiple schemas. But even if it has one schema, you still have to kind of reconnect it. And then I save it. Now that is defined. So now I have a pipeline to move from collector to integration. And I could leave it. I could maybe have a special pipeline where I just run this on occasion, so you can create as many pipelines as you need. Your main flow should probably be in one, and then you can do special cases if you need to do some, you know, something on a regular basis, but maybe every, you know, once every couple months. You could create a pipeline. If it's a one-off special thing, it's probably easier just to do it in Deployment Manager, create the script, save it in the folder, and deploy it. But this is how you go in and you build these environments. Now you can move these around. So like you can, you know, so if I wanted to add my infra and merge it in, or I want to go to my tests, you know, so you can move the boxes around, you know, for what you want it to look like. And you can zoom in and out. So if you need to put more boxes in there, you can zoom out so you can see them. It does have a kind of an edge. It won't let you go too far or too up. It does have kind of a border, but you can move them around depending on what you need it to do. So that's, you know, it takes a few minutes to set these up, but once these are set up, then you can create your Jenkins projects and run them, and then you can just run them over and over and over. So this is the next setup work you'll have to do. Have you guys played with this at all?
Yeah. I have played with this a little.
Okay. So the important part, I mean, to see if this is working, you can always use the command line, you know, and copy the command and run it from the command line, and then, you know, to make sure the certificate's working and the folders and all that, you know, in case, you know, something's not quite set up in Jenkins. So to make sure it's working, sometimes I run it from the command prompt just to make sure it's working, and then I can go into Jenkins and make sure that I have it, you know, set up correctly in Jenkins, because, you know, Jenkins adds its own user security, and you know, so that a lot of times I'll run command line just to make sure that the command is working, and then I can go into Jenkins and, you know, tweak Jenkins, and if I have to fix something within the Jenkins project to make sure that it's going to work. Okay, so for Jenkins, I'll come back to the main. When you want to load the plugin, you go to Manage Jenkins, and you come down here and you say Manage Plugins. Okay, and you have to go to the Advanced tab, and then you come down here and you choose the file. I'm not sure I have the file. Let me go grab it. So the file comes in the zip file under Integrations and under Jenkins. So I'm just going to copy this up to my downloads. Okay, so it's just an HPI file, and so I'm in my downloads. So I come here and I say choose file, and I have to get to my user, teamwork, downloads, and then I select it, and then I say open, and then once I have it here I say upload. Of course mine's already loaded, so I'm going to skip that, and once it's loaded it'll show up on the install tab, and so it'll give you the plugin and the version. Okay, and then once you have it installed you come back to Manage Jenkins and you do Configure System, and then you scroll down till you find, okay, so here's DBmaestro Teamwork. So here's the location of my jar file. So I just left it in the default location. This is the name of my Teamwork server, and then I set my default to Oracle. And then I said show advanced commands. So when you do validate and some of those things, and to let you see the other commands, you need to have this checked. And then that's all you do to configure it, and you click save, and it's set up. So now you can go to your different projects and create the projects to run that build. So to run Jenkins you need the certificate, your Jenkins security, and you may need the Teamwork security set up if that's enabled, so that the Jenkins user is allowed to execute those commands in Teamworks for those schemas. Okay, So that's part of the setup that you're going to need to do for to get the Jenkins to work. Any more questions?
It's okay, Cindy. You can continue.
Okay. Well, I think
It's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think I've covered all the main things for the automation. So if there's any other questions concerning automation, then I can answer those. If you have questions on Jenkins Pipeline Builder, the API commands.
There was just a question about the equivalent to the rollback when you were working with files. It's the same. When you use the refresh action, it's the same as it's equivalent to the rollback, is it?
It can be. So to do a rollback, let me go back to my pipeline. Okay, so to do a rollback, there's a couple different ways to do it. Okay, so I merged into integration, so I have the different labels. So if I come here and I show my labels for integration, now that I did another build, I have more labels. So here I ran the integration, so I now have an integration backup and an integration completion. So if I wanted to undo this, I could roll back to this label. So I could do a self action on integration and say deploy this label, and it would go back to that label. The other option I have is to go to collector and look at its labels. And what I could do is I could take, like if I wanted to roll back integration, what I did with infra, I could go back to the collector label and redeploy it, or I could go back to the integration label and I could come back to this integration label and say redeploy this label back to integration. So you have a couple different options. You can roll this one back, or you can go to an older version here and redeploy it. Now when you do that from one of these, since I have two schemas, I might have conflicts again. So the easiest thing is just to roll back to the label you want to here. So you would create a deploy job. We do a build on the label you want to roll back to and deploy it, and you'd use the self action because you'd only do it here. Okay, so that's one way to do it. The refresh, okay, so I made some changes in collector. I pushed them to integration. I made some changes in infra. I had a conflict, so I fixed the conflicts, but the fixed versions are on integration, right? So collector still has its version, infra still has its version, the originals. The merged version is only here. So what I could do is I could do a refresh, and I could take the changes from integration and move them back to collector and move them back to infra, so they both have the same version again. And so you can go, you can take production and refresh test, and take test and refresh integration, take integration and refresh collector and infra. So the refresh is like take the change and go backwards. Now you may have to do some merging, or you could say do override, and I want to take whatever's here and make both of these look like integration again. So you could do an override and just push the changes back. Or you could merge the changes if they've already started working on new stuff and you don't want to lose it. You could refresh and merge the changes back together if there's new conflicts because of going backwards. So there's a lot of different options depending on what you're trying to accomplish with the forward and the refresh.
All right, perfect. Any other question? Okay. Wait a minute. No lo captó. Sí. Sí. Ah. Okay. Okay. The question is about Cindy. the best practice is when you're working with Jenkins as a deployment tool, a continuous integration tool for not only database but also code. Yeah, how is better to work with that? You deploy first code, do it after the database deployment or the integration. What is best? What is the best thing to do?
I would think probably doing the database first would be easier because if something goes wrong there, you would not deploy the code. So if, maybe you create your Jenkins jobs to do the database piece, and then it calls once it's successful, it calls the part to deploy the application, because usually the application has fewer issues with, once it gets compiled and stuff. But then if either one fails, you could roll it back. But so it really doesn't matter which one you do first because you need to have them both complete, but it's more complicated to roll back the database piece. So that would probably be better to make sure that works and then fire off the step to do the code.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have application, so I can't put the application piece in, but you would just edit your different build steps to add the order you want them to go in. You guys, are you guys using Jira?
Yes.
Okay, I thought, okay. So if you're using Jira, what you can do is when you make a change, so like I'll just check this out. Close all of these. When I make a change, say I'm going to add another column, so I'm just going to call it address 2. If I can type. Something's not right there. Okay. Okay, and so I'm going to save it. Okay, so I've added a new column. Okay, so when I go to check it in, we have an integration with Jira. And so this connects me to Jira and pulls back my Jira tickets. And then I can say this Jira, this is in Jira. I can assign this Jira task to that change. And then when I check it in, it becomes tied to the change. So when it finishes checking in, okay, so now if we go to the history, see I have the Jira ticket tied to this particular revision of the object. And so if you're tracking your application changes in Jira, so if you have a ticket that says add a new field on the application, so now I have to add a new column to the table, Jira can take the ticket numbers and pass it to Jenkins. And then the Jenkins job can build the application, what it needs to do, and then it can pass those ticket numbers to the teamwork, build by tasks, and then it would just build the tasks associated with that ticket. It would just build the changes that have that ticket number. So that's another option, to control exactly what you're going to deploy. So we have that Jenkins integration. If you want to assign the Jira ticket numbers to the change itself. And then even through Deployment Manager, if I go to Deployment Manager and go back, okay, so here instead of picking a schema, I could say I want to pick a Jira project. Okay, so I have my HR project, and then see I have these different change sets. So I could say I just want to do this one, and then it knows what I checked in against that particular ticket number, and that's all it will build. So if I go next, I just say where I want it to go to. So here it says I have changes in these schemas associated with, so I only want it to go to integration as my target. No, I want to do that one. Okay, so then I pick my target and I say integration, and then use my baseline. Oop, target was not selected for, okay, so for here I want integration. That one I don't want it. Okay, so now I can say analyze, and it's only going to pick the few changes that were assigned to that JIRA ticket. So if I look at the script, you should find one. Yep. Oh, this one, it says ignore. Okay, so the changes are already there. So I have it backwards, but it would generate the script just associated with what's in that JIRA task instead of the whole schema. So that's an option. I can send you the JIRA integration if you want me to, the plugin. But that way you can tie the ticket numbers, and that gives you another option for deployment. So you can control some of it because JIRA has a Jenkins plugin, and I think Jenkins has a JIRA plugin. So you can control some of it from JIRA to Jenkins, and then Jenkins can pass the information to Teamwork for those change set IDs to build for you. So there's a lot of options when you start involving the Jenkins and the different DevOps tools together based on what you're trying to accomplish.
All right. Yeah, I think it sounds like a good combination when you use Jira with Jenkins and DBmaestro. Well,
okay, so
well,
all right, so we got 5 minutes. So you guys.
We're not hearing you, Cindy. Sorry.
Like I say, we got 5 minutes left.
You're
so
breaking up, Cindy.
Oh.
Hello.
You're breaking up.
Yeah, we're hearing you, David. You were here, David, all the time.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay, it says my audio was restored. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
I lost my audio for some reason. Okay, so what we thought we'd do is, okay, we just gave you a whole lot of information. Now you guys can go play with it and set up your pipelines, and then we'll set up a follow-up session to answer new questions, review maybe the configuration and make sure everything is set up the way you want it, and so that you can move forward.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and we would just want to work with this all this week. This is a really good material for us. I hope during this week we can get the things a little more done. I mean, and we will check out in January when we can do the next session.
Okay.
Maybe I have to talk to David. I think.
Yeah, we can